All right, it's 9 o'clock, top of the hour. Welcome to the Great Montana Ag Rally presented by Montana Agribusiness Association. This is webinar 7, session 1, sponsored by Anheuser-Busch. So if you're joining us here this morning, my name is Ryan Helmer. I'm the National Field Technology Manager for Wilbur Ellis Company, based out of Great Falls. And I've been on the MABA board now for 4 years, beginning of my 4th year. I will be moderating this morning's sessions, and I'd like to thank you for participating. This is a great series of 1-hour educational workshops to help our membership continue to stay informed and up to speed on the latest technology and information in agriculture. I'd like to thank Anheuser-Busch for their support of the rally and sponsoring this session. And this morning's presenter, let me find it here, is Michael Nepveux. Michael he serves as an economist at the American Farm Bureau Federation. His issues portfolio consists of livestock, dairy markets, farm bill and federal crop insurance, renewable fuels, and hemp issues. Napiew joined the American Farm Bureau Federation as an economist in May of 2018. He comes to AFBF from Informa Economics Agribusiness Group. His prior experience also includes placements with the Agriculture Department's Foreign Agriculture Service and the House Agriculture Committee. Nepveux earned a bachelor's degree in agribusiness and economics and a master's degree in agricultural economics from both from Texas A&M University. So good morning, Michael, and thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate having someone with some strong some background in economics to help us find our way through these tough times. So take it away.
All right. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you very much, everybody, for having me here today. Just as a little bit of background on myself and what you could expect from this presentation, my primary role, even though he listed off several commodities and areas that I work in, is that I cover primarily livestock here at AFBF. And as a result, the majority, let's just say this presentation might lean a little bit more livestock and policy heavy because that's the area that I work in. I'll try and throw in a little bit in there for the crops folks, but livestock and dairy is where most of my work is in. But to also start this off, we always have to try and address the elephant in the room. And I also like to throw out this disclaimer, just so I'm sure everybody's aware, but I'm not a medical doctor, nor am I an epidemiologist. So take what I say when it comes to COVID with a grain of salt, but I'm also not going to try to say very much because, quite frankly, I do not feel that I'm qualified to make any kind of projections about the way things are going. Other than I can say that the recovery in livestock markets, as well as the restaurant and food dining sector, is highly dependent on the trajectory of that curve. Right now, it looks like things are getting better, but again, this has been the 500-pound gorilla in the room, and it will continue to be, at least in terms of food markets moving forward and how consumers are spending their food. I remember it was about a year ago, I was speaking to a group in person to Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, and I had kind of a similar graph to this. Of course, it was way back at the beginning, showing the number of cases in China and just kind of pointing at it and saying, no, this could be a wild card. I don't know how big it's going to be. It may not be anything. And I've been working from my 1-bedroom apartment for the last year as a result of probably not giving it enough credit at the time. So I'm definitely not going to underestimate this. And very much a good portion of, again, the restaurant sector and what I'm going to talk about moving forward is going to deal entirely on this recovery. Even though I know a good portion of this presentation is going to be forward-looking and what we can expect moving into the spring, but it is in order to contextualize that, it is important to remember and look back at exactly what happened. So again, in the livestock sector, in the meat and animal protein processing sector, in order to fully understand the impacts, it's helpful to understand how we as American consumers were spending our food dollars before COVID hit. For the last 4 years or so, the majority of Americans' food dollars were spent away from home, not at grocery stores. They're spent at restaurants, fast food. You can think institutional demand, things like baseball games, hotels, colleges, schools. That's where the majority of our food dollars were being spent. And of course, everybody knows the punchline here is that's where COVID really struck down pretty hard in terms of its greatest impact on the food service sectors. We saw back in late March, early April is whenever the government shutdowns, the shelter-in-place orders started hitting around the corner. And you see that huge drop in food away from home spending in the red line on that graph on the left, and a corresponding spike in the blue line, which is food spent on food at home dollars. So going to your grocery stores and retailers and purchasing food that way. One thing I always like to point out here that I guess folks may not always think about is some people kind of had this mindset. I remember talking with folks back in March and April that, oh, it's going to be okay because what they weren't buying at the restaurants, they're just going to buy an equivalent amount at the grocery store. And you'll notice that blue line does not spike in the same way that red line drops. There's a lot of value add going through the the restaurant and food service sector. The value of a hamburger that you eat at a sit-down restaurant is going to cost you a lot more than buying the components and making it separately for a family of 4 or 6 at home. So that's not going to, it did not, and it will not translate to an equal spending of money as a result. Other folks don't really seem to realize is that these supply chains developed and evolved over time into very different supply chains. And you can't just snap your fingers and flip a switch and move what was going into the food service and restaurant dining sector back into the retail channel. Some of this, it's as simple as going back down to different packaging sizes. A pizza place is going to be buying 20, 40-pound bags of mozzarella, and the consumer is buying 8-ounce to 16-ounce smaller bags of shredded mozzarella. You can't make that switch. There's also a lot of government red tape. So eggs is another one where they had to modify some of the requirements around putting them what would have been destined to restaurants and retail going back into the grocery stores. There's also just consumer preferences. What we tend to eat at restaurants is not always the same thing we're eating at home. You really saw this in the cutout subprimals and the primals at the beginning of the pandemic. You saw what typically would be the highest price middle meats crater, and what typically are the lowest price your in meats, think what ends up being in roast and ground beef, skyrocket. So what was driving the cutout value back in late March of last year was actually consumers running to the grocery store and emptying out the grocery shelves, and the things like ground beef were really pushing the value of that cutout as opposed to, say, a tenderloin, because the steakhouses were all shut down and your average consumer isn't going to be taking a filet mignon and cooking that at home. Some people might, but most consumers aren't quite familiar with that level of food preparation. We have seen a pretty strong rebound. You can see that particularly in the graph on the left, year-over-year change in food service sales. At the end of 2020, we still were looking at a pretty difficult area in terms of the holiday sector. A lot of these folks, they were able to thrive at the end of the summer because they adjusted to outdoor dining. I don't know how cold things got up in Montana over the winter, but in a lot of areas, you think particularly your East Coast cities, a lot of those folks were not able to do much outdoor dining during the worst of it. So hopefully, as we move into the summer and you see the vaccine becoming more widespread and cases declining, we can start to see some of those areas open back up more. So I tend to think about what happened in the animal processing sector, because this is what really hit the headlines back in April and May of last year. You had CEOs of major processing companies putting op-eds in the New York Times or other papers saying we are at a critical point and drastically close to losing our food supply in America, basically. So I look at this as two separate events. You have the demand side event and then a supply side event. The demand side event, I already kind of talked about. It was the consumer response in March. You saw lockdown orders start to hit. You saw consumers rush to the grocery store to stock up their freezers. You saw pictures floating around in social media of empty meat cases, and you did see a price response in the beef and pork cutout as a result of this. And that at the time was a really big deal, but at no point did we ever really get in a position where we're not going to have an adequate food supply in this country. And then you move into April and May, which I would characterize as the supply event. And you can really see that in these two graphs here, is where, again, I don't truly believe that we were ever really in danger of running out of meat in this country. But you did start to get to a point where that wasn't a foregone conclusion. You saw the supply event is whenever workers were getting sick at plants. You saw entire plants being shut down, meatpacking plants and further processing plants. Even bigger than the individual plant shutdowns is you saw a massive amount of reduced throughput of all the plants that remained open. This is primarily tied back to those labor issues. They couldn't get workers into the plants as they had installed all these social distancing type measures in place. You're just naturally going to start to see a reduction in flow through the plants. So even though we had some shutdown, I think it was a bigger deal that you saw a lot of plants that were still open operating at 50, 60, 70% of their capacity. And that's where you started to see this drive down in your total cattle and hog slaughter. So the worst of it was that first week of May. We were looking at slaughter numbers, and meat production for beef and pork was down about a third, a little bit over a third. Again, so that to me is whenever I talk about the supply event, that's really where you saw that. So one natural result of that is animal weights. When we're talking about beef and pork and poultry production, we've really evolved into a much more efficient. We've almost become a victim of our own efficiency in certain areas, particularly in your hog side of things. And that's where we started to see some pretty negative impacts in some areas of the country. So very unfortunate that we had to see some euthanization of animals. That the hog in particular is very much a just-in-time delivery system. They don't really have a lot of slack in the system to be able to hold animals back. But they did their best. They worked with nutritionists. They worked with their breeders. They tried to slow the flow of animals and slow the weight gain as best they could. Cattle, you did not see as much. I don't know if there were any actual reports of euthanization of animals. You have a little bit more wiggle room in the cattle supply chain. You can keep them out on pasture longer, you can feed them out longer. But one result of that is that you get that backlog of animals. Again, we are down about a third, 34% in terms of processing year over year. So with that amount of animals being backed up into the system, you're going to get heavier animals moving through the system. So at the worst of it, we were about 45 pounds over 2019. And again, that was going in through some of the summer. We never fully really recovered in terms of those weights as we finished out the year. So we still ended up we followed the seasonal curve up, but we still ended up being well above where we were. And so we still have a little bit of an issue with heavier animals coming through. One impact of that is that if you were to look at that previous chart that I showed you of the cattle and hog slaughter and saw, I told you at the worst of it, we were down a third from a year ago. Would you believe me if I told you we actually finished out the year pretty much even in beef, up in pork and poultry versus 2019? Part of that is we started out the year going pretty good production in terms of beef and pork. If you look at these lines, these are showing year over year change in both beef and pork. So basically the way to interpret it is if the line is above that black line, then you're above last year. So early in 2020, before the pandemic, beef was running 5, 10, even as they ramped up at the beginning of trying to respond to those price increases in March, about 15% above year ago levels. And then they mostly recovered, even if we operated the rest of the year primarily at a reduction in overall processing capacity. Because we were bringing those heavier animals as we were working through that backlog, we ended up increasing our beef and pork production over a year ago levels. So we actually ended up producing in terms of production for above year ago or at year ago levels for most of our animal protein. So that was actually, at the worst of it, I probably would not have guessed that we would have ended up finishing out the year as well as we did. It's also, in all honesty, our industry recovered pretty darn well for it, because we kept hearing about the V-shaped recurve with the economy. We really did get a V-shaped recovery in terms of animal processing. So that, I think most analysts were projecting it would be a slower recovery than we actually got in terms of livestock production. Livestock processing and animal protein production. So I always debate whether or not to include this, because it tends to get producers pretty riled up. And believe me, when this was going on, this is something that I heard about pretty much every single day. And it frustrated a lot of producers, because at the same time that this was spiking, you were looking at price of fed cattle going down, you're looking at price of hogs going down. And it was kind of similar to what we saw with the Holcomb, Kansas fire back in 2019. As you started to see a reduction in processing capacity, unfortunately, the result is that means less beef leads to higher prices, and you have an immediate oversupply of animals on the market, pushing down prices on them. So if you remember, maybe about, I don't know how many slides ago, I mentioned that I looked at it as being a supply and demand event as two separate events. You can really see that in the chart on the left. So that blue line is 2020. You can see about halfway through March, that initial spike in the value of the cutout. And sorry, let me back up a bit. This is showing the value of the box beef cutout and the pork cutout. So if folks aren't very familiar with it, you can think about it as the value of the cow in meat form. So this is a proportional weighted average of all the different cuts of beef and pork that come out of it and taken back to 100 weight. So this is that initial spike back in March was, remember, you had consumers rushing to the grocery stores, trying to stock up their freezers. But at that time, that was more of a short-term logistical supply chain hiccup. Again, we weren't actually seeing any shortage in beef or pork or poultry. We were not seeing any reduction in slaughter capacity at that point in time. That was just, retailers didn't have enough on the shelves. They got caught flat-footed, and they all rushed into the spot market trying to refill their meat cases. And that's when you saw, at the time, a very historic spike in the beef cutout. They kind of got things back in place into March, into early April. You saw the price start coming back down. And then we started to see the real impact of the supply shortage and the processing issues at the meat packing plants. You can't really tell it very well from this graphic, but you did have a bit of a rockets and feathers phenomenon, like you do see with gas prices, and that the price shoots up very quick. It's just it's a little bit slower to come down than it was to go up. Again, it's kind of hard to tell from the way this looks, just because of the height of that spike and how high it got. With pork, one thing I tend to do is I'll include 2014 on here, just to contrast the historic difference between beef and pork and what we were looking at. Pork, obviously, that spike was just as much of a shock to us. But if you remember back to 2014, we had another disease, this one impacting only pigs, which decimated the U.S. hog herd. So from a consumer and retailer and wholesaler point of view, I don't think it was much as, let's say, a psychological shock, because they had seen prices higher than that and at that level within the last 5 years or so, or 6 years, going back to 2014. So again, while it was a historic spike in terms of overall value of the pork cutout, we have seen extreme levels in our at least recent history for folks. Trying to give a little bit more of, let's say, a forward look in some of these things. And again, this might lean a little bit more in what you can expect a lot in terms of agricultural policy moving forward. American Farm Bureau, we are an organization heavily involved in ag policy. So crystal ball, we'll talk a little bit about where markets are heading and what's going on, but this is probably going to be a little bit more focused on what you can expect out of DC, we've had turnover in 3 of the 4 corners in terms of House and Senate Ag committees, a new administration placed, new Secretary of Ag. They're still getting everything set up, and we got a lot of moving parts here in DC in terms of agricultural policy. One thing that is just massively outstanding to me is we've had about $45 billion in ag hot aid for American agriculture just in the last 3 years, since 2018. Now, there's been two pretty big, I would call black swan events. Black swan doesn't happen very often. You expect it to not occur multiple years in a row. We're getting to a point where is it really a black swan event if you're starting to have to use the phrase black swan to describe an event every 1 or 2 years kind of situation for us. So we had what started as the trade war with China through the previous administration. And what they did is they decided to use the authority under CCC, the Commodity Credit Corporation, to make payments, direct payments to farmers who were negatively impacted by the results of that trade war with our largest agriculture, or one of our largest, NAFTA countries tend to be our largest agricultural customers. But between China and we actually, if you remember back into the trade war, we started out with our own little mini trade war with our NAFTA partners as well. So through the MFP program, they made a significant amount of payments. And then once things seemed to be getting better and we were looking at a brighter future, then we had a global pandemic hit, which again, I don't think I need to hammer home how much that impacted farmers. So I'm not in any way suggesting that these payments were not warranted. On the contrary, many farmers would not be in business today without these kind of payments that were paid out. Just highlighting that, this is a unprecedented amount of aid that was passed down to American agriculture. Again, very much of it was needed. Moving forward, we can expect a little bit more. So this is going back to a bill that was passed in December as basically part of their budget negotiations and setting forward, moving forward, we have this December COVID package. They spelled out a lot of aid specifically for agriculture in there. So price trigger crops. So this goes back to our CFAP program. So if you remember how CFAP organized their government programs through that program, we have price trigger crops, which is primarily your row crops. This was, they had to see a certain percentage of price decline, and I'm sorry, off the top of my head, there's been so many different bills coming through. I don't remember what the dates were from, sometime in the spring, January, February of last year, through the worst of COVID, whenever they passed the original round of COVID relief back in early summer of last year. In addition to that, they spelled out cattle inventory payments. We had top-up payments for swine. So that would have been coming through the original CFAP 1 authority. So I guess I should have put a little bit more background in here. We have a CFAP 1, a CFAP 2, and then this most recent COVID package was passed. We're not calling it CFAP 3 yet. We're still trying to figure out how the program is going to be implemented, because we got caught in a weird situation where they started to implement some of it. The new administration came in and put a pause on some of it. So everything right here is still currently in limbo, but it was passed into law. So we know at some point this kind of money is going to be flowing down. A big one for this one, for a lot of our members, and honestly, Montana's probably not going to have too many of these types of producers, but contract livestock and poultry growers. Through the original authority under CFAP 1 and 2, USDA determined that they didn't really have the authority to make payments to your contract producers. This is really big in the broiler world. They own the barns, but they don't own the birds or the feed or anything like that. That's a very vertically integrated industry. And since they didn't actually own the commodity itself that saw drop in price, USDA decided that they didn't have the authority to make payments to them. So that was a big one for us, is that they included that. And then in early January, we saw this program start to be implemented by USDA. So they opened up applications for contract and poultry growers. They announced that they'd be doing a top-up payment on swine producers who enrolled in CFAP 1. And then there were a few other small, they adjusted the formulas and they opened up applications for this. And then the new administration came in and put a freeze on that while still accepting applications. But the problem was they had it frozen as the deadline was approaching. So we got them to extend the deadline, but at this point, we're still in a little bit of a state of flux in what that exactly means. Now, the program that I'm referring to was only for contract and poultry growers that top up for swine, and then some of the formula adjustments for your price trigger crops. The rest of this, your cattle inventory, the big money coming in for the price triggers, a lot of these other programs, we're still waiting on details from USDA. So hopefully they'll be getting that out to us relatively soon. So I mentioned cattle payments. So this was specified in the law. They came up with, it was, again, a really just strange, unnecessarily complicated formula. But at the end of the day, this is what they're looking at payments coming out to cattle producers. So you're looking at $63 a head for fed cattle. Feeders, they're looking at either $7 for your light ones and then $25 for your heavier ones, and then all other cattle and mature cattle as well. Yeah, that's changed over. Sorry, it was a very similar graph color than the other one. For your price trigger crops, the bulk of that money is going to be going to corn with about 1.8 billion. Then you're going to see a good amount go to soybeans following that, wheat, cotton, sorghum, barley, and then sunflowers is another one that is big enough to pop up on the list. They added another chunk of money into the Paycheck Protection Program. So this might have, I don't know how familiar folks are with this. This, I would imagine, the Agribusiness Association is at least somewhat familiar with. So Paycheck Protection Program was a series of forgivable loans that was part of the original COVID relief. They put out a couple of tranches, and agriculture actually did not really get to participate as strongly as many of the other industries. There was a lot of issues at the front end, and the authorities for agriculture to participate, as well as dealing with the SBA. They were not always, there wasn't a lot of, I guess, consistency or attention paid to the agriculture side of things, but they got things figured out and were able to get some of those loans out to agricultural operations. So as long as this was paid to the approved sectors, at the end of the day, the loan would end up being forgiven. So as part of this most recent package that they passed, they're looking at upping up some of the money into the PPP as well. I believe there's applications currently open. I'm sorry, I probably can't go too much more into detail because I'm not as informed on the PPP side of things. One of our other folks handles that mostly. So I talked about the level of farm income that was a result of these ad hoc government payments. This is, again, we were in the black swan situation. We're in unprecedented times. Everybody keeps using that word, but it really is true. And the payments very much were needed for American agriculture. But realistically, it's going to be hard to argue that it's very sustainable to have such a large percentage of your federal, your U.S. farm income come from federal support. So in 2020, we're going to likely have finished with around 40% of U.S. net farm income come from federal support. Again, very, very much needed, particularly at the time and dealing with what was going on. The reason I bring this up is not because I personally am criticizing it. This is something that we're going to have to deal with moving forward. Is there's a lot of folks out there who have been pointing to this level of money going into agriculture and talking about how whether or not we need to be relying on it as much. And this is your typical groups out there. A lot of them your anti-agricultural groups, a lot of them more your budget deficit hawks. This kind of level increasing has rubbed a lot of folks the wrong way. So again, that's just something that is the realistic problem of working in Washington, D.C. is it's going to be hard to defend some of those payments moving forward, probably. We're probably not going to have to worry too much on whether or not, hopefully, whether or not agriculture needs some of this additional support based on what's been going on in crop prices. So this is actually pretty funny to me. I had a coworker go on maternity leave in November before you started to see the strong rally in grain prices. And she made it very clear that she's unplugging completely. She's not going to deal with anything. And then she started back in, let's say, early February. And she kind of pulled me aside and asked, what the heck happened in commodity prices? I'd never really stopped to think about it. Like if you just stepped away in November and then you came back and you're looking at 550 corn, that was pretty big shock to her. So this is a world we're living in where it's great for your row crop producers, your livestock producers a little bit less thrilled about it. Ethanol producers as well, considering that they've seen a drastic demand destruction in terms of you have a lot less people out driving around, and you have seen a huge hit in demand for ethanol. So, but from a crop perspective, this is great. Part of what's been driving that is these massive reductions in ending stocks and stocks to use ratio that we've been seeing in terms of USDA updates. So this is just what they were anticipating from May 20 to the most recent WASD. Actually, sorry, not the most recent WASD. We don't have February's in there yet. Haven't updated the slide since then, but you're still looking at pretty massive reductions. At the same time, a lot of our crop is being demanded all around the world. You're seeing export shipments, particularly to places like China, increase dramatically. So this is a really bullish environment for a lot of crop producers out there. And like I said, I might primarily cover livestock, so don't ask me any hard questions on crops because I may not be able to answer them. Net farm income. This is one where, again, this is a little bit difficult to really defend at times the level of government support, which again, I personally would argue is very much needed, but some of the critics of agriculture out there are pointing at this and saying that's a pretty massive amount of government support in terms of 30 to 40%, depending on if you're looking at net farm income versus gross farm total income. We actually ended up 2020 in a more comfortable position as a result of those government payments. Again, without the government payments, we would have been pretty much in line with where we were the last several years. We've been in a pretty bearish environment. We had large stockpiles, ending stocks across the board, and we weren't looking at the most favorable environment. So hopefully moving forward, they're projecting around $25 billion for 2021 in ad hoc support. Again, that's including some of what I had already talked about coming down the pipeline in terms of legislation. Net farm income, $86 billion, not including federal support moving forward. I mentioned at the front end, we've actually had a changeover of 3 out of the 4 corners in terms of the Senate and House Ag. So you had Chairman Peterson out of Minnesota on the House Ag. They're in the majority. Democrats have the majority in the House. Lost his election, and as a result, we have a new chairman there, Chairman Scott out of Georgia. Senate Ag Democrats, with the resulting flip of the Senate, she was already there, but now she's in control of the gavel. So you have Senator Stabenow. On the Republican side, we had a retirement. On the Senate side, Chairman Roberts decided to not seek re-election and enter retirement. And now we have a new senator in charge of the Republican side of the Senate in the minority, Senator Bozeman out of Arkansas. And then on the House side, you had another retirement on the Republican side. Senator Conaway out of Panhandle in Texas decided to retire, not seek re-election, and the Republicans have put G.T. Thompson, representative out of Pennsylvania, in charge. So that's a lot of turnover. I don't know if we've ever had a point where you had 3 out of the 4 corners switch over while also seeing a change in the administration. So with Secretary Perdue having exited the building, we now have a familiar face in Secretary Vilsack moving forward. This is one where he was there all 8 years under the previous President Obama's administration. We're probably going to be looking at a bit more normalized agricultural secretary and dealing with maybe a little bit somebody who's familiar with the job and a little bit back to return to the old, but we're also anticipating a focus on some of these other issues that that maybe weren't as big of an issue back and 4 years ago during or whenever it was first put in place in 2008. You're going to see a lot more concentration on environmental issues. Climate change is going to be a big one. Equity and representation across the department as well. You're going to see a lot of that happen in agriculture. Another thing that we have coming up in this administration is the next farm bill. This is one where I don't have to tell most folks in agriculture what the farm bill is, but we're looking at it's going to be probably a bit of a challenge moving that forward with the Senate being as tight as it is. So this is something where a lot of folks don't realize, yes, the Senate is technically in Democratic control, but it's still technically a 50-50 Senate, which means when it comes to committees, they actually have equal representation of senators. You're still going to have equal number of Republican and Democratic, much tighter margins to overcome for a lot of folks. And while the Democrats are holding the gavel in each one, if you end up with a 50-50 split, there's still going to be some disagreements as bills exit committee on how to get them to the floor. So this is going to be pretty complicated. I've heard some rumblings that, because we still have another election before they really need to pass the farm bill, how much work is actually going to get done before that election when they really see where the chips fall and figure out whether or not you want to put so much effort into putting something together. And then if you're a Democrat, you lose majority control. If you're Republican, you potentially gain majority control. Also, don't look to me to tell you what's going to happen there. Election forecasting is not something that I'm going to even pretend to tell you I know how to do. Trade, a little bit back more in my wheelhouse. So we are projecting record agricultural exports for 2021. And by we, I mean USDA. But China is poised to become become the top U.S. market. They have been one of our key trading partners for a very long time. Our usual suspects are the NAFTA folks, Canada, Mexico, China, Japan, Korea are usually pretty high on our list as well. But after a few years of challenging trade relations with many of these folks, that is one bright spot in U.S. agriculture relations as we're looking at seeing a strong increase in agricultural trade going overseas. Now, this isn't all, and at no point would I mean that to be purely a political statement. A lot of this is market driven. You have massive reductions in the hog herd in China, which is starting to hit a pretty strong rebuilding phase, which is going to just increase their demand for soybeans so they can crush it into meal to feed those pigs. And moving forward, we're looking at our U.S. agricultural trade balance to improve. Trade balance is exports minus imports. You remember the previous administration focused on this measure quite a bit. They felt that the U.S. as a whole has a negative trade balance, but agriculture, we love to point this out, is especially if you really care about the trade balance being negative, we're one of the few positives in terms of trade balance, and that's only going to get better in 2021 as we see our exports continue to increase across the board. So specifically to China, last year, we ended up hitting a record. That was pretty strong showing, particularly in the last couple months of the year. We didn't quite hit the phase one. It was probably a little bit of unrealistic expectations that we ever were going to actually hit the levels of phase one, but I'm going to count it as, seeing that kind of increase from 2019 to 2020 back to those 2012 levels was a pretty significant increase. There's legitimate disagreements on whether or not you can count that as being because of political trade negotiations of phase one, or if you can chalk it up more to, at the end of the day, China needed the beans, they needed the pork, they needed the beef and the poultry. They were going to buy it regardless. Those are some fairly legitimate arguments moving forward. This phase one agreement was incredibly unusual in that you don't really see trade agreements where people promised a certain level of purchases. That's not something you tend to see. So it will be very interesting moving forward to see if our future trade agreements or trade agreements between other countries start to include some kind of specific level like that. Usually a trade agreement is we lower tariffs, we lower our trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, technical barriers to trade, SPS, phytosanitary issues. We'll fix all that, but we're not going to promise to buy a certain level from you. Most trade agreements are going to be between countries where they tend to have more, let's say, free market, but the government doesn't control what private enterprise buys. Let's put it that way. So in the U.S., our government can't tell somebody what to buy or tell our folks to purchase a certain level of grain like they can necessarily in China. I mentioned a little bit, and I know I'm bumping up on the timeline, so I'll pick up the pace here. I only have a few more slides, but mentioned a little bit on China's pig herd recovering. So this is primarily as a result of African swine fever, which just absolutely decimated the country's hog herd. This is one where, I get excited about because I cover livestock stuff, and I don't think a lot of folks fully realize exactly how big of a player China is when it comes to the world's pork. So before ASF, back in, let's say, 2018, China produced and consumed roughly half the world's pork. Half the world's pork. Their herd is the largest by far. And whenever ASF started to hit their country and we saw the decline, it really shifted around the way animal protein flows around the world. So historically, China had not been a big importer of pork. Even though they consume half the world's pork, they are largely self-sufficient. And if you think back to the way their herds were set up, we're going to see a big change moving forward. So historically, it's always hard to really pinpoint data coming out of China because it's China. It's a black hole when it comes to reliable data. A lot of folks, as much as we complain about USDA reports, people don't realize how fortunate we are to even have a government that tries to track and decimate reliable information on that. So with China's stuff, a good portion, and you can say maybe 20% to 30% of their pig herd before ASF was what we would call backyard pig operations. These are folks with, 10, 15 pigs. They're largely they self-sufficient. They'll raise them, they'll slaughter them, they'll eat them. They might take a few to the market to sell. It's not there's not a lot of biosecurity, which is a big deal when it came to ASF. One of the ways ASF spread is direct pig-to-pig contact, pig-to-surface contact. So if you wore your boots into a barn that had ASF and you walked into another barn, you likely just brought it in. And then they also spread it by eating contaminated product. Well, for those backyard operations, they do a lot of feeding of untreated swill, which means they'll eat some contaminated pork, doesn't impact humans, so the humans don't even necessarily realize they're eating it, and then they throw it into the backyard for the pigs, and then a lot of it proliferated that way. Then you say there's a big chunk of pigs in this medium-sized operation, not quite backyard, not quite what we'd call these larger operations that import US and EU knowledge and run like a real agricultural operation with lots of biosecurity. But ASF really decimated those smaller herds. It hit the medium-sized herds and it hit the bigger herds too. But we're going to look at kind of a restructuring of the way pork is raised in China, which is good for U.S. soybean producers. So they're going to move much more to that larger, more industrialized model where they feed an industrialized feed ration. Whereas, all those backyard pigs, they weren't necessarily being fed soybean meal. They were being fed, like I said, a lot of untreated swill. So it's a little bit of a trade-off and hard to really predict, because while you're going to see the shift of animals into more of those industrialized type operations, you're going to see less animals because those backyard pigs aren't producing a lot of meat per animal. So you're going to see the overall herd probably not recover to the same levels that it was, but the pigs that are there are going to be a lot more efficient. They're going to be consuming more corn and beans. You're going to see dairy products, dried whey, permeate going over there for your starter feed crop for pigs as they get wings. That's going to be a boon for U.S. agriculture. In the meantime, it's great for U.S. pork, U.S. beef, and U.S. poultry. And honestly, everybody else around the world is sending their beef, pork, and poultry over to China as well. It's not just us. I mentioned the protein demand. So ASF hit at the back half of 2019. You saw a lot of pigs die in the fourth quarter of 2019 and throughout 2020. As a result, it was a boon for animal protein producers around the world. So for us, we actually, for the first time, got to participate in poultry exports going to China. Not the first time, sorry, the first time in several years to participate, because they lifted their ban that they had in place on us for a while. And then our pork exports to China just exploded. It was very strong for beef exports as well. Pork is obviously, they love their pork, so they're going to import a lot of that. Poultry is probably a little bit closer and easier to from a price point perspective, as well as just a consumer preference perspective. But we have seen a strong surging, an increasing demand in beef for them as well. With that, I think I might actually cut it there because I know we're approaching the 10-minute mark for the hour. So I wanted to be sure to leave a few seconds of questions.
Michael, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your insight here. Montana's a huge cattle state, big wheat state. So having your insight there is very important. I was looking if you have any questions, please dump them into the Q&A. I did come up with one or two here. One of the questions I had was, do you think with some of the supply crunches and the processing crunches we had when COVID really hit us hard in that time frame on your chart, do you think we'll move away from some of the just-in-time hyper-efficient models, or are we going to just continue to ride that horse?
I think that's a really good question. Thank you for it. I can also kind of break it out into, it ties into another discussion that's been going on in the industry along the lines of a disaggregated, we have such a concentrated supply chain model. So I'm going to try and answer both of those. I think your question, you're more likely to see a response there. I think you might see a little bit more slack built into the system. I don't know to what degree we would move away from such a just-in-time delivery system. Again, that efficiency, I mean, we didn't just do it to do it. We did it because it made a lot of economic sense. Consumers now have more affordable, high-quality animal protein. These businesses, businesses aren't going to do something if it's going to lose them money. So we did it for a reason. But I think you could probably argue that there is a reasonable business case to have more slack built into it. I don't know what necessarily that's going to look like. If it's in terms of inventory management, you might see retailers try to operate more along those lines. Now, in terms of, we've heard a lot of calls from folks as well to break up or maybe move to more of a regionalized processing sector, less of these massive plants that have those giant economies of scale. this I'm just parroting folks that I consider much smarter than myself. So I get to interact with a lot of extension folks, a lot of the professors who are really involved in the meat processing sector. And one thing pointed out is, we don't know that a disaggregated, more regional supply chain would have performed any better, because COVID hit every county in the US. COVID spread like wildfire. It wasn't just these big meatpacking plants. Even smaller plants, you're still going to have that shoulder to shoulder type work, which is just, and that, I think that's really what the main problem was. And right or wrong, that's the way the industry has evolved over time to operate. And again, they didn't move to that way for no reason either. These economies of scale are huge. And it's not just one thing a lot of folks don't realize is the regulatory cost of complying with, those regulations are there for good reason. We have to have a safe and stable food supply, but there's massive regulatory costs, and being able to move a lot of head through that plant and to spread that regulatory cost over a lot more head, you can reduce the cost per head in terms of your marginal cost. So that's one where I don't know the answer, but that's a really good question. And it's a conversation that is certainly being had.
Yeah, and it's certainly something that I think there's a lot of state legislatures that are going through various bills looking for more of that localized processing, and the regulatory side is one of the biggest holdups on it. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. The other question.
Sorry, I was going to say you had actually triggered something that I should have mentioned, is that we're also, as an organization, very pro regional processing, in the sense that, I've gotten the question from members before of like, is it really going to make a huge difference with one big plant being down if we have more of these regional plants? And I think a good answer is, in the grand scheme of things and the total availability of supply in the US, probably not. A small plant is going to take hundreds upon thousands of those smaller plants to make up for a few of these big plants. But that being said, it's a big difference to the producers in the region with that localized. There's certain areas where, just because of the way the industry is involved, they do already rely on those smaller regional plants. And it's very important that we have strong, smaller regional plants. I'm originally from Texas, and a lot of our South Texas growers do rely on, these smaller plants in Corpus Christi and other areas around the state that they don't have access to those massive plants where you can move it. So again, we're very pro making, we're one of those all of the above answers. We want the smaller ones. We want to reduce regulation impediments to make those small, very small and medium-sized packers, and add whatever incentives we can to make them more economical.
Just one more quick question, and hopefully there's reasonably quick answer. We'll see. We're almost out of time here, but with the global economy starting to open back up, we're getting more access to, say, China, for example, and India than maybe we had during the previous administration. Global supply stocks seem like they're down, and we're also in a situation where the US dollar is starting to wane a little bit. I think it's off 6% on the year. We're kind of in a situation where we could have kind of a commodity super cycle moving in our favor. What's your kind of thoughts on that?
That's a lot to try and answer in a short period of time. I'll also start off by saying, short answer is I don't know on whether or not that's actually going to develop for us. We don't, how to phrase this, agriculture relies very much on exports. We have viewed that as a lot of our future, particularly, let's say, the pork industry. After porcine endemic diarrhea virus, they really kind of made this conscious effort to expand production with an eye on exports, soaking up most of the residual coming in there. So we're big fans of anything that makes exports work better. It is generally the position of the U.S. government that a strong U.S. dollar is better. So we'll see how that develops over time. I don't know if I'm giving a really adequate answer to that, but I don't know how we're going to see that develop over time.
Bullish or bearish for 21? What's your feeling?
Bullish.
Bullish.
I think the world's And that both from a international and domestic perspective. The international perspective, I do think we are going to return to a bit more of a normalized period in terms of trade relations with these other countries. I know you mentioned specifically India. I'll believe it when it happens with India. But I do think the fundamentals going beyond just the political back and forth between these countries, particularly going back to China, and they're still in a position where they have such a strong demand for animal protein in terms of beef, pork, poultry going in, while they build out some of their herds. And it's not just pork. They've also made an adjustment in terms of their broiler. They have a different style of production, but they're going to be building out these animal herds and be needing that protein coming in. And I mean, they bring in soybeans for kind of a twofold. They prop up their crushing industry. At the same time, they really need the meal to feed their animals going in. So I'm pretty bullish on international opportunities as countries come out of COVID as well, and you start to see some of that pent up demand spending as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, Michael, and American Farm Bureau Federation for having you here with us, and also Anheuser-Busch for sponsoring this session. I've got a couple pages of notes here. I'm pretty excited about today's discussion. So thank you so much. And our next session will begin at 10:30 for those of you following along at home.